I've known DeVore Fidelity top banana John DeVore for 20 years, first as a sales floor hustler at Stereo Exchange in New York City, then as the purveyor of his DeVore Fidelity line of speakers, of which I have owned the 8s, the Super 8s, the 9s, the O93s, and the O96. I currently have John's Super 9s in for review at Stereophile magazine. And while I have made many videos with John, this is different. Today we dive deep into JD's own serious hi-fi kit, his playback system at the infamous MONKEYHAUS, dozens of cartridges, 3 Tonearms, a $70,000 EMT preamp, multiple power amps, and his own OREF speakers. Hold on, grab a drink, and get ready for the serious gear nerd out. Greetings, everyone. I'm at the Inner Sanctum. I am in the highly desirable place to be on a Friday night, the MONKEYHAUS in Brooklyn Navy Yard here in New York City. And before you is the very tall giant, John DeVore.
The tall giant. Thank you, Ken. Welcome.
My pleasure, my pleasure. We're here to, John agreed to let me go into, to have him go into deep detail on his system, which is sort of an enigma. I think people really want to know what's in your system. And I've been coming here for years, and now you have 3 Tonearms, and he just showed me a row of like really desirable cartridges up top, and there's just so much to know. And this is not just like a system for pleasure. This is your work system as well.
Right.
You probably have a pleasure system at home. So I just want to have John sort of go through his rig in nerd-like detail as to what the cartridges are, what the Tonearms are, why they're considered great, why he has them, what functions they play, in his appraisal of various speakers that he builds with amplifiers. So I'll have questions as we go forward. But John, if we could start with your cartridges, what are they and why do you use them?
So there's, as you said, there's 3 Tonearms mounted on the turntable. So there's 3 cartridges on there at the moment. On my Origin Live Tonearm is my Koetsu Coralstone, which I've had for quite a few years now. It's, I would say, more than half polished down, but it's got a few hundred more hours left to it, I would say.
You mean the stylus is polished down?
Yeah,
That's what you call it?
It has thousands of hours on it.
Wow.
It was my main cartridge for years.
Wow.
I love it, love it, love it. It's a beautiful sounding cartridge.
What do you use to align cartridges to Tonearms?
It depends enormously on the Tonearm. So some Tonearms come with really well-designed jigs, like an SME or something like that comes with it. It's a great system. Some of them are more general. I have things that can show me overhang, so I'll get the overhang right on the cartridge, and then you can twist the cartridge in the head shell. I mean, everyone is a little different, and so those things, that's most applicable to the Origin Live arm. The other 2 arms are the removable head shell type arms, and they're very different geometry. So the back arm, that's a Dynavector 507. And that, with the removable head shell, so that I got so that I could use some of the Ortofon SPUs that are the G geometry. So the G head shell SPUs from Ortofon are the longer body SPUs. They had the A body ones, which are the really short ones, and then the G body ones, which are the longer ones. So what I did is I set that arm up for the G geometry. So that's the distance from the spindle to the pivot. And then I have a bunch of head shells that I bought. And every time I mount a cartridge in a head shell, I align it to that same G geometry. So the stylus is where it would be if it was a SPU-G. And that way I can swap those out really easily. I mean, I can swap cartridges and get it all dialed in 5 minutes.
Right.
So I have, one of the, many, it's probably 7 or 8 of those cartridges up there are mounted on head shells in the geometry for the Dynavector. So at the moment, what's in there is a Lyra Etna Lambda SL.
Wow. Tell me about that cartridge.
That's my newest cartridge that I got. I've only had that for a little while, a couple of months, less than a month. It's a remarkable cartridge. So for me, it really is synergistic with the Koetsu Coralstone. The Koetsu Coralstone is full-bodied, beautiful. It has real presence in a room. Sonically, we're talking about. It is also beautiful because it's carved out of fossilized coral, but sonically, it's robust. It's flesh and blood. It's sort of unflappable. Has really excellent dynamics. Tonality seems really right on. And then, as a nice complement to that, the Lyra is the closest thing to sort of master tape. It handles sort of the dynamics, the low distortion, and astounding detail in the mid-range and treble better than any cartridge I've ever heard. It doesn't sound like other cartridges in the way that a master tape doesn't really sound like a record. And that's not saying one is better than the other. The master tape is obviously the source, but a lot of times a record, just because of the nature of its record and whatever you might be playing it back with, can sound more pleasant or even maybe sound more real in the listening room. So the Lyra has just explosive dynamics, fantastic, just tracks brilliantly. So in a sense, it sort of has a bit more of a modern vibe than the Koetsu. Wow. The Coralstone is the most modern Koetsu I've heard, compared to like a black gold line, or I also have a rosewood. But so for me, the two of those cover 100% of what I would expect from any modern cartridge. So for playing stereo records.
So you don't use like a one-size-fits-all Ficard protractor to set up all those cartridges with arms. You have different protractors.
I would if I had one of those fancy protractors. I don't know.
You don't have one of those?
I mean, so most protractors, they're using the same geometry. There's like a few Longren or Bearwald, whatever.
Ficard does all three, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just like you pick one, and so the Origin Live I think is Lofgren A, and their setup is pretty good. You just, as long as you get the overhang right, which is pretty simple the way I do it, then you're just twisting the cartridge in the head shell to get it lined up and square, and you're done. That's it.
That's a vintage Dynavector Tonearm? That's modern.
Yeah, they've been making versions of that. It was a 505 and then a 507. This is the 507 Mark II, I think. So it's current. That's a current Tonearm.
And I know the Origin is current, right?
Yeah, that's an Origin Live. It's an Agile Mark 12, 12-inch Mark IV.
And
that's my newest Tonearm acquisition.
Oh, yeah,
that was a barter with the Origin Live guys. So they showed with my Oh Babies at the last show in the UK, and that was part of our barter.
Mm. And the SPU, is that an EMT Tonearm on the left?
This is an Ortofon Tonearm. This is an RF-309 vintage. It's an old one. It has been breathed on by Alfred Brokerand, who he tweaks. He sort of does updates, or he restores, and he now is making his own Tonearms. But this is an Ortofon. It started out as an Ortofon.
On a brass base, it looks like?
That's a big bronze. Yeah, so the turntable, which we'll get to, is designed so they're all interchangeable arm bases. So I made all of these, and they're all they can all go in any of the holes, and they can rotate to reposition the pivot to stylus kind of points.
Right.
So this Tonearm is set up for a really old-fashioned type of cartridge. So this is set up sort of pre-SPU, it was the EMT connection. So the bayonet connection at the end. Now, first of all, it's made for the shorter body cartridges, which are the older ones. So I was saying the Ortofon SPU A versus the G. The A was the original geometry. So it's a much shorter stylus to mounting screw distance. And the earliest version of those arms, the contact pins in the end of the arm, so originally there was only 2 pins because everything was mono. There was no such thing as stereo. So it was 2 side-by-side pins, positive and negative. When stereo came along, they put 2 more pins, positive, negative, for the other channel. So you had 4 pins in a little square diamond shape.
Huh.
And that was the way everything was until SME decided that they were going to make their 4 pins rotated so that they were a square.
Huh.
And the SPU, that became, not SPU, but the SME style became the industry standard. But if you have old cartridges, you need to have that old diamond shape. You need the EMT diamond shaped pins. So you can get EMT tone arms with those. So this is set up for that. And on it is an old EMT Bakelite OFD25, which is a mono cartridge. 25 is the 25 micron stylus, so it's the larger of the micro groove. So you know, mono records would either be like a 25 or a 15 or more modern stylus profile. So I have an OFD 25 and an OFD 15.
When do those date from? What era?
The Bakelite EMTs, I think. So EMT, they're called Tondos. So the EMT head units became magnesium, I think, in the 70s.
Wow.
So these would have been before that.
And when does that arm date from, more or less?
This would have been 50s, I think, for this RF.
Is that little silver, bronzy, circular, is that just for protection?
That's so you don't bump if you bump that, the cartridge goes flying and everyone's unhappy.
So you use, you will listen to mono to evaluate speakers sometimes?
Yeah, sometimes. Or for pleasure, yeah. But sometimes, definitely. So the process of designing speakers for me is very, very slow. It takes a long time. So I have a lot of tracks. So the real tool tracks mostly are digital, so that I can go back and forth and like easy to reproduce. I can stop, start, make a change, stop, start. But then within that group of sort of tool tracks, there are a number of records for sure. But then outside of that, as part of the design process, the speakers will live in here for a very long time. My designs take me years. And so over the course of the design, the pleasure listening is part of the design and part of the voicing. And there's, I have mono records in here that I know really well. And if they don't sound right, then, that's, you never know what, if you're not using test tones, you're using music, you never know what piece is going to show you a flaw or some potential thing that you need to address. And so, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes a mono record will be the thing that gets me, rings a bell, and I have to focus in on something. Do you
use test tones as well at some point?
Some test tones, mostly for measurements. I do the test tones.
Right. Huh. Well, that's great. Take us through the. That's a Garrard 901, 301. I get them confused. 401.
Yeah, Garrard 401. Close cousin, younger brother of the legendary 301. Very similar. It's an idler wheel mechanism. This has been completely rebuilt. The motor's been rebuilt. This has a Shindo platter and bearing on it. Oh. And then it's in a plinth that I designed with all of the interchangeable arm boards. So I have probably, I think there's, including turntables that are on loan. There's probably 5 different turntables that I've built around that are, some are, belt drive, direct drive. I have a plinth with a Technics SP10 Mark II in it. So there's a lot of different technologies, but they all have the same interchangeable ARM board system. So they can all sort of be, and I can have arms go from one system to another, or that kind of a thing.
And why Bakelite for the plinth?
It's a great material. EMT, the EMT 930 was Bakelite. Bakelite is a great sounding material. It's a really good, easy to machine. It's a very good, high density, non-resonant material.
Not often used though anymore.
Not so much.
For whatever reason.
So I know Fernan Roby makes Bakelite turntables.
Huh.
Bakelite, so the reason that cartridges aren't made of Bakelite anymore is because it was, something about it was outlawed in the EU. Maybe the chemicals used in the process or something like that, the toxicity. So that's why Bakelite sort of was starting to be phased out.
Do you make your own Tonearm wires into the phono pre, or?
Some of them are homebrew. Some of them, so that the Origin Live came with their top Tonearm wire, which is excellent. So that's what's used on that. I've made, so the Dynavector is using an Auditorium 23 Tonearm wire. I basically was a pair of interconnects that I cut the ends off and put a DIN plug on. I have a couple of those. A23 has worked good for, it's good sounding for Tonearm.
And the base the plinth is sitting on, what's that made of?
It is, so plywood. There's a bunch of lead on the plywood to stabilize that. And then it's a 3-point suspension. It's an extremely damped suspension. So there's no springiness, but it does move a little bit. I don't, you can probably see that a little bit. So the 3 posts are inch thick bronze rod.
Wow.
And then it's an adjustable.
Inch thick.
Yeah, it's heavy bronze, 3 heavy bronze rods.
And what is, how does Shindo redo that? Is that like an original platter but redone Shindo world?
No, it's 100% made by Shindo. It's a different size from the, so the inner ring where the idler wheel rides is identical dimension to what the Garrard would have been, but it's all, otherwise it's different dimensions. It's wider, it's quite thick on the outside edge for a sort of a flywheel mass effect. The bearing is way longer and bigger than the original Garrard was. The reason this is this height is the bearing. The bearing is very close to touching the bottom.
Huh. Why? I was at He Who Shall Remain Nameless, whose studio is not far from here, has this amazing complex out in Pennsylvania, and he has one floor full of vintage turntables. And he had one turntable, and like the spindle, the bearing rod went all the way to like the floor.
Oh, that was like the RCA one?
Yeah, why did he do that? Stability?
There's two. There's a couple of modern turntables too that, so some of them, the shaft would go down to the floor, and essentially there were like very heavy rotating masses on the bottom. So that was more additional sort of flywheel inertia kind of thing. I think there's maybe it's a Clear Audio. There's a few modern turntables that do a similar kind of thing.
But this idea is similar?
No. So a long bearing can, not necessarily, but can give you more stability. So if you've got a really short little bearing, the thrust part of the bearing, so where the weight is sitting on the bottom of the bearing, so there's also inverted bearings, but we're just talking about regular ones. So the weight of the platter is on this thrust. So maybe there's a ball bearing, or sometimes there's like a little Teflon thing. But then you need to prevent the bearing from kind of rocking back and forth. And so there's a collar up towards the top of the bearing.
Right.
So the longer that is, the more stability you can get. You don't have to have as tight a tolerance in order to prevent the thing from rocking one direction or the other as much.
Right.
So there's a big advantage, other than the cost of machining something precise that big, there's a huge advantage to a longer bearing.
So it's a full-on idler wheel? There's no belt in there like a Thorn's?
No, the Garrard is just idler.
Wow. And what did you make the footers out of? Are they brass or
Bronze.
something?
Yeah, those are the bronze. They're basically bronze acorn nuts at the bottom of the rods. Basically, it bolts the plinth with all that mass. There's the lead on the plinth. It bolts that all into one solid piece from which this is now sort of isolated.
Wow.
And then the Garrard, also the motor of the Garrard, which is giant, is hung from the top of the plinth. So it's also suspended.
Wow. I wonder why more people don't use Bakelite. Yeah, because that was like the standard, like in radios forever.
Yeah. Well, also, yeah, it was very decorative as well. You could make it in different colors.
Right.
Yeah.
Non-resident.
This is this type of Bakelite. So this is a phenolic. I mean, a lot of people use phenolic. Wilson cabinets are phenolic.
Right.
So this is a specific type with it's the phenolic resin impregnated in a very fine linen. So there's many, many, many layers of linen cloth in here, and then that's impregnated with the resin, and it's compressed in very high pressure and temperature. So there's a lot of different ways to get phenolic. Phenolic can also, like a lot of circuit boards are phenolic, and you can have different substrates. You can have glass fiber, you can have paper. Phenolic is very common. So phenolic and Bakelite is a brand of phenolic. It encapsulates a lot of different materials.
Wow.
Yeah, the linen phenolic is my favorite for these kinds of things.
So you can buy that as just a piece of phenolic?
Big sheet, yeah.
Wow. Huh. Fascinating. Oh, well, let's move on to that incredible looking EMT. Is it a phono pre or full on pre, and what's the model number?
Full on pre, JPA 66 Mark II.
And is that a new piece, current piece?
I believe it is still current. I think it's a Mark III now. But EMT will still build these to order. It's incredible. I've had this now for quite a few years. I don't even know how many years now, but so this preamp, the prototype to this preamp, was debuted at CES in my room in 2007.
Oh, really?
So Jules Lyman, who was at that point, he was the owner of EMT. This was his pet project, and he introduced it at CES in a system in my room.
Huh.
And we played, LPs, mono, and we played 78. So what makes this really kind of above 99.9% of the other great preamps out there is that it is infinitely variable EQ curves. So this will cover any recorded disc EQ. It's not just a few switches like you can do either this, or this. It's infinitely adjustable. And so we played 78s that year, and I was completely blown away, and I lusted after one of these since 2007. And,
did you have that? Was it a Capital that year where you played 78s? Or wherever that was.
Oh, last year at Expono.
Oh, yeah.
No, I didn't bring this. I used that was a preamp by Mola Mola.
That still sounded, that room was
preamp,
unbelievable in the scale of the 78s.
Mm-hmm.
Well, take us through each one of those little knobs and dials besides the ones in the middle. What do they do?
All right, so it has four separate phono inputs. So each of these controls one of the four phono inputs. So all three of these tone arms go into their own optimized input, and then there's one more actually open. That's source selection. So it's the four phonos plus two line inputs. This is the EQ for the phono equalization here. These also have to deal with the phono equalization. So this is a scratch filter in and out. There's mono, stereo switch, mute, and subsonic, and then balance and volume.
So what's the little rubber band thingy?
The rubber band thingy is my little homebrewed remote control for the volume, because I am a lazy ass. So yeah, this is a little remote control motorized knob with an IR receiver on it, and when that knob turns, the little rubber band turns the volume on the EMT.
And what is the case of that made out of?
Of the EMT?
Yeah.
Well, it's a hammer tone paint,
Uh,
and it's all vacuum tube, a big outboard power supply right here. Same, it's
Wow.
full size chassis. It's a giant power supply,
wow.
and it's it's very sturdy, balanced in and outputs.
All point to point, I guess.
No circuit board.
Really?
The prototype was point to point, and because of the complexity of the circuit,
right.
it looked like a shoebox filled with cooked pasta. It was insane. So yeah, no, the production ones are circuit boards.
So they're all moving coil inputs?
2 are moving magnet, so that you can use. I have outboard transformers, and 2 are 2 different moving coil, 2 different transformer, couple of moving coils.
The step ups you made yourself?
Only one of them, yeah. Yeah, one of them. So the Koetsu is going into an Auditorium 23 T2 homage T2 transformer.
I have a T1, yeah.
Yeah, and then the Lyra is going into the built-in moving coil transformer in one of the EMTs, and then the Bakelite is going into a vintage transformer that I boxed myself.
Wow. So it's interesting. It is circuit board, and it sounds so incredible. So that's, I guess, point to point is good if you're dealing with like a simple circuit, a simple line stage or something. Or even a power amp.
The more complexity you get, the harder it is to implement in point to point.
Of course,
sure.
it's
Yeah.
more insanity.
Yep.
What's that little Sony piece right there? To the left of the phonoproof.
So these are 2 vintage Japanese step-up transformers. It's a Technics and a Sony. They're moving coil step-ups. They're not in the system at the moment, but yeah.
So moving coil, so step-ups have always been used. Today's dumbest question.
Oh, they go back. Well, they go way back. Yeah.
And all the cables, like connecting the, what are the cables connecting the preamp to the power amps? More Auditorium 23?
So all of the interconnects, other than like the Origin Live, all the interconnects in here are either Auditorium 23 or Shindo interconnects, balanced or single-ended. And then there's a few exceptions. I've got a few long runs up to the cassette deck, and I've got one for the analog to digital converter up there, and then there's one to the balanced tube section for the Technics 1500 reel to reel.
Wow.
So those are other. So there's and they're a mix of different things. There's an audio note audio note RCA interconnect. There's some Belden balanced cables running up. There's some various things. Yeah.
Shindo and Auditorium 23 interconnects are hard to find now. I have a pair of Shindos, but is Aschenbrenner still in business? Making
he's not. They're not available in the U.S. I don't know if he's still in business or not. Yeah.
To get really gurked out and needy, nerded out and geeky, how would you compare? Are the Auditorium 23s a little more laid back than the Shindos, which are a little pushy sometimes?
Yeah, a little
right.
bit. Yeah, the silver is a little bit more. A little more open, a little bit more emphasis towards the upper mids, and the Auditorium 23s is a smoother, kind of more chilled out.
Is it copper?
Copper, yeah.
Wow. Crazy, man. I love it. Take us to your Komoro leader. Is that
you want to do the digital front end first? And
then
the power amps?
We can do digital, I guess. Yeah.
Aww.
No, go ahead, of course.
So I use Roon for digital. I have a little Roon. It's an Intel NUC running a Roon core on it, and then I have a 12 terabyte RAID with the music on it, and then that's going to the TotalDAC. There's the 2 truncated pyramid things down there on the bottom. The upper one is the TotalDAC server and reclocker. And then that connects with a AES EBU digital to the DAC below. So that's the digital system.
I guess when they're on, they light up in some capacity.
They're on.
Well, they are on.
They only light up if they're changing a setting.
Oh,
wow. I have
the
setting, the displays off.
Wow.
They just sit there, relaxed, quiet.
Sound better with the
until
displays off, you think?
It's supposed to. That's what the designer said, so I just did it. I don't need to be looking at it.
And then, which is it all Camaro at the moment for power amps?
At the moment, I'm using the Camaro K300S. This was the first production Camaro that we did as a company.
It's a stereo amp?
So this is a stereo 300B single-ended amp. So that's what's running in the system at the moment. So because my system is, it's the design system, there's a lot of different power amps that get rotated in and out. So, and that's a very critical part of designing speakers. I really want to make sure that I'm never designing a speaker to suit a single amp or even a single type of amp. So, since the very beginning, so 25 years now, I've always had a corral of sort of my favorite examples from different types of amps. So at the moment, for low power single-ended tube, it's the Camaro 300B. But before that, it was an airtight. Before that, it was an audio note. So there's always been a single-ended 300B amp in the system.
Right.
My high power vacuum tube is that big
Beast.
Audio Research as a VT130 SE, so that's 110 watt.
When does that date from?
That's from the 90s. I've had that for a very long time. I think I had that when I started the company. Either that or I had its predecessor, the VT100. But
where'd you get that? Sound by Singer or something?
That was I think it was a customer that I originally sold it to back when I was working at Stereo Exchange.
Huh.
And he traded it in to In Living Stereo, which was one of my very first dealers as DeVore Fidelity.
That's where I first heard your speakers, yeah.
And Steve knew I loved the amp, and he hit me up, and I bought it from him. So yeah,
it looks very heavy.
It's massive, yeah. It's a beast, but it's a great amp. And then there's a couple of other tube amps, like sort of medium power tube amps. I have a Music Reference amplifier. It's a push-pull single EL84 amp up there. And then there's a few more, but those are the main tube. And then for solid state, I have high power and low power solid state. The low power solid state I've had for the longest and gets the most use is my Pass Aleph 3, a little hedgehog. It's over there on the shelf.
Oh, that's it right there, yeah.
Yeah, I've had that so long it's sort of turned red.
Yeah.
Because it runs hot, and so the black anodizes, it gradually goes red, but I love that amp.
Right.
And then I also have a first watt SIT2.
Oh, right.
Also low power, that's about 10 watts, that's about 30 watts. I had an SIT3, which was not a good match for the high impedance. So that's another thing that I've learned over the years is, especially with the higher impedance speakers, so O96, O Bronze, O Reference, they're all above 10 ohm load. And not all amplifiers like that. So these are two that really did like it, but I had a first watt SIT3, which absolutely did not like the high impedance. It sounded fine on a pair of Super 9s, but was really boring sounding on O96. SIT2 is the opposite. It sounds amazing on the high impedance, so no problem there. So that's the other thing, is that over the years, I've tried different amps here and there. Actually, a little side note on that. Early on, another friend of mine took in on trade a pair of... So I started in the industry in the end of the 80s. I was selling hi-fi. And my dream amplifier all the way back to then was a pair of Threshold SA1. They were these 160 watt pure Class A monoblocks from Nelson Pass. They were the coolest things. They had beautiful meters. They sounded amazing. We had them on Apogees, we had them on Duntech Sovereigns, we had them on 801s. So I always had dreamed of having a pair of those. So I finally got a pair of those. This was probably 20 years ago. No, probably 15 years ago, because the Orangutan 096 existed at that point. It was early on. And it was one of those amps that did not sound good into the high impedance.
Huh.
It sounded great again on the regular 8 ohm or 4 ohm, but it did not. It was sleepy sounding on the high impedance. It was very disappointing. So for high power solid state, I have recently made a change. So for years, my high power solid state reference was a Parasound A21, and that was great sounding, really good all around bruiser of an amp.
Yeah.
I traded that in for a Parasound JC5, which broke my heart because it didn't like the high impedance. It sounded blah. It sounded as good as I remembered the A21 sounding on the on like a Super 9, but on the orangutans it was dead and lifeless again.
I thought in my ignorance that high impedance was always good. I thought amps didn't like speakers that dipped like down to 2 ohms or something.
A lot of speakers since the 80s are, a lot of amplifiers since the 80s have been specifically designed for difficult speakers. Wilsons, Teals, for
right.
years.
Right.
If you owned a really high-end, state-of-the-art speaker, it was a brutal speaker to drive. Infinity IRS, Wilsons, Sound Lab, Apogee. These were brutal speaker loads. And so, Krells, Mark Levinson's, the Threshold, my experience with the Thresholds, all of those amplifiers are optimized to be working hard. They need to be pushing against a really tough load. And when you unload them, they don't know what to do. Not entirely. Some of them sound amazing. Like the Parasound A21 sounded great. The JC5 didn't. So it's I don't know if it's a hit or miss. I don't know if it's because some designers care about 16 ohms or they have a 16 ohm reference and some don't. Maybe it's just random chance that some designs work, some don't. So, but one of the tricks that I've learned over the years is that a bridged amplifier sees a load that is half. So if you put a bridged amplifier into an 8 ohm speaker, it's driving a 4 ohm speaker. So the bridged amplifier is seeing 4 ohms when it's driving an 8 ohm speaker.
And you've also, it's amazing to see the amount of work and the depth of research you do and all the listening you do, which explains to me why I think you're so successful is all your speakers sound good with anything. They sound good with all amplifiers, cheap integrated, expensive tube amps, because I've played them with like everything I've had along my audio journey, and they always sound great. And this is like, I guess, the proof that you're putting. And another thing you do that's so singular is the return to the wide baffles.
Yeah.
Which is still pretty. I mean, my Voltis are wide baffles, but these are a certain shape of wide baffle.
Mm-hmm.
And explain again why you like a wide baffle. Coming off the 80s and the 90s and everything, and even like Pearlstein, the light speakers still as thin as they can be to shove the drivers in, but you don't go for that. What does that give you, the wide baffle?
That's still the common practice. For
right,
sure. Yeah.
Right.
And all of my original models, all the Gibbon models and the Silverbacks, those were all narrow baffle.
Right.
The Gibbon Super 9's narrow baffle. There's essentially that baffle is as narrow as you can make it with the woofers in it.
Right.
The wide baffle came from the Orangutan series. The idea behind the Orangutan series, starting with the 096, was to make a speaker that behaved normally in a room, but was compatible with very low-powered tube amps. So it had to be high sensitivity, it had to be high impedance, it had to be, in my experience, this is just my experience, if you're going to try to drive something with a single-ended triode, like a 2A3 or a 300B, it better not be more than a two-way. I think that starts to make it, you can hear the drawbacks if you start getting more complicated than that with a single-ended triode. So it dictated a certain type of speaker to make. I didn't want to have horns because like I said, I wanted it to integrate and to behave like a normal speaker in a normal room, so that your listening distance was fairly normal, the dispersion was fairly normal, the aesthetic was fairly normal. So it was going to be a two-way. It had to be a larger woofer to get the sensitivity. So as soon as you make the woofer 10 inches, you know you're not going to have a narrow baffle speaker anymore. So I started playing around with it, and I realized so there's a phenomenon in speakers, the way speakers project the energy into the room. It's what's called a step response. So the step response happens at a frequency where the wavelength that's coming off of the speakers, I think I just hit the mic, sorry about that. The wavelength coming off the speakers, when that wavelength becomes significantly wider than that front baffle, it goes from essentially all of the energy going out in a hemisphere, so 100% of the energy going forward, to wrapping around and becoming more omnidirectional. And the lower the frequency, the more omnidirectional that becomes. So, and that frequency is dictated by how wide the baffle is. So the baffle step, the wider the speaker is, the lower in frequency you push that baffle step. So a really, really narrow speaker, that baffle step, so the speakers become less efficient at that point, and that point gets pretty high. And some companies compensate for it, some don't. If you're going to compensate for it, you're going to need to doctor the response of the speaker, so you can either reduce the efficiency at the upper end, or if you've got a 2.5 way, you have a second woofer to sort of give a little bit extra boost at the low end, something like that to balance it. But so with the wider baffle, I was able to push the step response down far enough so that I didn't even have to address it. I could address it in the response of the woofer itself. And so essentially, it's a higher sensitivity speaker for more of its output. And so it just the way it puts energy into the room is significantly different from a narrow baffle.
Wow, when I go to shows, and I go to a lot of shows, I cover a lot of rooms.
You do?
It's I don't
hardest working man in hi-fi review.
It's some sort of neurotic need. I don't know what it is exactly, but in the norm are these tall speakers with a gazillion drivers, and they just don't sound natural. Now, is that because, in my ignorance, they require a complex crossover to deal with all those drivers?
Not necessarily.
Huh.
Well, a million drivers it's going to be a more complex.
It'll have 3 woofers, 2 of which are mid-range, and it'll have a Diapolito tweeter thingy with, and beryllium this or that, or...
Many drivers is harder to drive. So a good friend of mine, J.C. Morrison, he used to host these parties called New York Noise. And these were all the legendary DIY guys. So this is like Herb Reichert, Komoro was part of this.
There's Don
the
Garber.
Legendary, like Blackie Pagano.
Right.
So these guys would all build these crazy homebrew. Anyway, I could keep on listing names, but they would just come with these harebrained, utterly zany tube amplifiers. There was one guy would bring in, the amplifier was built on a hand truck, and he would just wheel the whole thing on, all the tubes jangling, and exposed 2,000 volts, exposed wiring here everywhere. But they were mad fun. They were amazing. And so one of the years, but they needed speakers to put them on. So a lot of times they would be, somebody would have a voice at the theater, or it would be one year there was a pair of Altec or maybe Western Electric 755s and a big wide baffle.
Wow.
But one year JC, he used to host it in his loft in New Jersey. He made these giant line arrays. So it had 20 or 25 or 30 of these full range drivers all in a row. And he would wire them in series and parallel in order to get a nice high impedance. So they were high sensitivity, high impedance, and then he had some, Raven ribbon or something in the middle, and they were very high sensitivity. And none of the amplifiers, maybe the Komoro could drive it, but the amplifiers were having a really hard time driving it. So it's not just the sensitivity, and it's not just the impedance. It's just when you have all of those drivers hooked in parallel and series, even if it's an easy seeming load on paper, it's very complex for that amplifier. A single-ended amplifier has no protection from abuse. There's no, most of these had no feedback, so they had no sort of distortion correction in it. A push-pull amplifier has a lower output impedance. A single-ended amplifier has a high output impedance. So it's less able to deal with all of that back EMF that's coming off of all those drivers.
Right.
So it's not just simple or complex crossover. It's the whole picture. It's all of those things going into it.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Ken. Always.